The small community center in Manchester stood weathered and unassuming on a gray afternoon in March of 2019, its brick walls holding decades of neighborhood gatherings and forgotten performances. Inside the main hall, folding chairs had been arranged in crooked rows for the annual local talent showcase, an event that drew modest crowds of family members and curious neighbors looking for free entertainment on a Saturday. The atmosphere buzzed with casual chatter as people filed in slowly, many clutching paper cups of weak coffee from the refreshment table near the entrance. Nobody expected anything remarkable from this gathering, just another parade of amateur singers, awkward dancers, and children reciting poetry they had memorized for school. The event coordinator, a woman named Patricia Hayes who had organized these showcases for 12 years, shuffled through her clipboard checking names and performance times with the weary efficiency of someone who had seen it all before. Among the 24 performers listed on the schedule was a name that meant nothing to anyone present, a 16-year-old boy named Daniel Warren who had signed up to play piano. Daniel sat alone in the third row from the back, his thin frame hunched slightly forward as he studied his hands in his lap. His clothes told a story that everyone in the room could read instantly, a faded jacket that had seen too many winters, jeans with worn knees that spoke of hand-me-downs or charity shops, and shoes that had been repaired with glue more than once. His dark hair needed cutting and fell unevenly across his forehead, partially obscuring eyes that darted nervously around the room as if expecting trouble. The boy had arrived early without any family members accompanying him, a detail that several people noticed and whispered about in hushed tones that carried more pity than kindness. When Daniel had first approached the sign-up table 2 weeks earlier, Patricia had almost turned him away because he looked so disheveled and uncertain. But something in his quiet determination made her add his name to the list. She assumed he would play something simple, maybe a basic melody he had learned from YouTube videos, and she scheduled him in the middle of the program where less polished acts typically performed. Now as she glanced at him sitting alone, she felt a pang of concern wondering if he would actually go through with it, or simply slip out the back door when the pressure became too much. The boy seemed to sense her looking and met her eyes for just a moment before quickly looking away, his jaw tightening with what might have been resolve or might have been fear. As the showcase began with a group of children performing an off-key rendition of a popular song, the audience settled into their seats with polite applause and distracted conversations. Parents filmed their own children and largely ignored everyone else's performances, while teenagers in the back rows scrolled through their phones barely looking up. 3 acts in, a middle-aged man attempted a magic trick that went embarrassingly wrong, causing sympathetic laughter to ripple through the crowd. A woman sang a shaky version of an old ballad that made several audience members check their watches. This was the expected rhythm of such events, a parade of earnest mediocrity that people endured to support their loved ones. Nobody came to these showcases expecting to witness anything that would stay with them beyond the afternoon. When Patricia finally called Daniel's name, announcing him simply as a piano student, several people in the audience exchanged glances and smirks. The boy stood slowly and made his way to the stage with careful steps, his thin shoulders squared against the weight of dozens of eyes following his progress. As he climbed the 3 steps to the platform, someone in the middle rows made a comment just loud enough to be heard by those nearby, something about hoping this wouldn't take long. A few others chuckled, not cruelly perhaps, but with the casual dismissiveness that people often show toward those they perceive as beneath them. Daniel's shabby appearance and solitary presence had already marked him in their minds as someone to pity or ignore, certainly not someone who could command their attention or respect. The piano sat center stage, an old upright instrument that the community center had purchased decades ago and maintained poorly. Its finish was scratched and dull, several keys were slightly yellowed, and everyone knew it went out of tune regularly. Daniel approached it like someone greeting an old friend, running his fingers gently along the edge before sitting down on the worn bench. He adjusted his position carefully, his posture straightening in a way that transformed him slightly, making him seem older and more composed than he had appeared moments before. The audience's chatter didn't quiet immediately, many people still talking among themselves as they waited for him to begin. Some were actively not paying attention, confident that whatever came next would be forgettable background noise to their Saturday afternoon. Patricia stood near the side of the stage, ready to politely applaud whatever simple tune emerged, already thinking ahead to the next performer on her list. She noticed how Daniel closed his eyes for a long moment before placing his hands on the keys, his chest rising with a deep breath that seemed to gather something from deep within himself. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing his youth and the exhaustion that seemed permanently etched beneath his eyes. In the audience, a woman whispered to her husband asking if they could leave after the next act, saying she had errands to run. A teenage girl in the front row yawned openly. The atmosphere was one of polite endurance rather than anticipation, a room full of people prepared to sit through another forgettable performance out of social obligation rather than genuine interest. Then Daniel's hands descended to the piano keys, and everything changed in the space between one breath and the next. The first notes that rang out were not tentative or amateur but crystalline and purposeful, each one placed with such precision and feeling that conversations died mid-sentence across the entire hall. He had chosen to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece of profound beauty and technical complexity that announced immediately this was no ordinary amateur. His fingers moved across the keyboard with fluid grace, drawing from that battered old piano sounds that nobody had imagined it capable of producing. The melody flowed through the room like water finding its course, delicate yet powerful, each phrase shaped with an emotional intelligence that spoke of not just technical skill but deep musical understanding. Within seconds, the atmosphere transformed completely. Phones were lowered, conversations ceased, and every person in that hall turned their full attention toward the stage where the poor boy they had dismissed was creating something extraordinary. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Daniel's fingers danced across the keys with a confidence that seemed to belong to someone else entirely, someone far older and more experienced than the shy teenager who had shuffled onto the stage moments before. The transformation was so complete that people in the audience found themselves leaning forward in their seats, drawn into the music as if by an invisible thread. Every note seemed to carry weight and meaning. The soft passages whispered with heartbreaking tenderness, while the fuller sections swelled with restrained power that never crossed into showiness. His eyes remained closed for much of the performance, his face reflecting the emotional journey of the piece, with subtle shifts of expression that suggested he was somewhere far away from this shabby community center. The melody spoke of longing and beauty, of sadness touched with hope, and somehow this boy who looked like he had never known luxury was channeling feelings that resonated in the chest of every listener. Patricia stood frozen at the side of the stage, her clipboard hanging forgotten in her hand as she watched in disbelief. In 12 years of organizing these events, she had never witnessed anything remotely like this, never seen such a gap between expectation and reality. The technical proficiency alone would have been impressive, but what struck her most was the musicality, the way Daniel seemed to understand the soul of the piece and communicate it through his playing. Around the hall, similar reactions played out on face after face. The smirking teenagers now sat motionless with their phones dark in their laps, the bored parents who had been checking their watches now completely absorbed. Even the woman who had wanted to leave early sat transfixed, her hand pressed unconsciously to her throat, as if the music had lodged itself there. The shabby clothes and worn shoes that had marked Daniel as someone to dismiss now seemed irrelevant, rendered invisible by the transcendent beauty pouring from his fingertips. The piece built toward its climactic moments with Daniel guiding the crescendo with perfect control, his whole body swaying slightly with the music's momentum. His hands moved with such assurance across the keyboard that it was clear he knew this piece intimately, had lived with it and loved it until it became part of him. There were no stumbles or hesitations, no moments of uncertainty that typically marked amateur performances. This was the playing of someone who had dedicated countless hours to mastering not just the notes but the meaning behind them. The old piano responded to his touch as if awakened from a long sleep, producing tones that rang clear and true despite its age and neglect. People who had sat in this hall for dozens of events over the years and heard that same piano produce clunky sounds now listened in amazement to what it could achieve in the right hands. As the nocturne moved into its gentler closing passages, a profound silence had settled over the entire room, the kind of reverent quiet that usually belonged to concert halls and cathedrals rather than community center showcases. Every person present seemed to understand instinctively that they were experiencing something rare and precious, a moment that would separate itself from the ordinary flow of their lives and remain vivid in memory. The music grew softer and more intimate, drawing everyone closer into its private emotional world. Daniel's face showed complete absorption, peaceful and focused, as if he and the piano and the music existed in their own realm beyond the reach of judgment or mockery. His fingers touched the keys with increasing delicacy as the piece approached its conclusion, each note carefully shaped and released into the breathless silence. The final notes hung in the air like the last light of sunset, fading slowly into silence that felt almost sacred. Daniel's hands remained poised above the keyboard for a long moment after the sound died away, his eyes still closed as if reluctant to return from wherever the music had taken him. Then he opened them slowly and lowered his hands to his lap, his shoulders releasing tension as he came back to awareness of the room and the people watching him. For several seconds, nobody moved or made a sound, the audience seemingly held in suspended animation by what they had just witnessed. It was as if the spell of the music needed time to release its hold, as if breaking the silence too quickly would shatter something fragile and important. Daniel remained seated at the piano, looking uncertain again, the confident performer receding and the shy boy returning as he waited for some response from the people who had dismissed him so easily. Then the applause began, not polite scattered clapping, but a wave of genuine enthusiastic response that started in the front rows and swept through the entire hall within seconds. People rose to their feet without thinking about it, driven by an instinct to honor what they had experienced with more than just sitting ovation. The sound filled the space, loud and sustained, punctuated by cheers and exclamations of amazement. Daniel looked startled by the intensity of the response, his eyes widening as he stood from the piano bench and faced the audience properly for the first time. His cheeks flushed with color and he ducked his head in an awkward half-bow, clearly uncomfortable with being the focus of such attention. But the applause continued, people clapping until their hands hurt, some wiping tears from their eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Patricia found herself clapping hardest of all, her clipboard dropped on a chair as she joined the standing ovation with tears streaming down her face. Several people called out questions and encouragements as the applause finally began to fade, asking where he had learned to play like that, telling him he was amazing. Daniel made his way off the stage with the same careful steps he had used to approach it, but now people reached out to touch his arm or pat his shoulder as he passed. An elderly man in the second row stood and shook his hand firmly, saying something that made the boy smile shyly. The teenagers who had been smirking earlier now looked at him with something like awe, their casual dismissiveness replaced by genuine respect. Patricia intercepted him before he could return to his solitary seat in the back, taking both his hands in hers and asking urgently where he had trained, who his teacher was, how long he had been playing. Daniel's answers came quietly, almost reluctantly, revealing a story that made his gift seem even more remarkable given the circumstances from which it had emerged. He had taught himself primarily, Daniel explained to the small crowd that gathered around him during the break, learning from library books and free online videos because private lessons were far beyond what his family could afford. His mother worked 2 jobs to support him and his younger sister after his father had left years ago, and there was never money for extras like music instruction. He practiced whenever he could find access to a piano, sometimes at school after hours when a sympathetic janitor led him into the music room, sometimes at churches that left their doors open, once even at a shopping mall that had a display piano until security told him to stop. The nocturne he had performed was one he had been working on for almost a year, listening to recordings over and over until he could hear every nuance in his mind, then painstakingly teaching his fingers to reproduce what his ears understood. His dedication was absolute despite having none of the advantages that usually accompanied serious musical training. No supportive family attending recitals, no progression through prestigious teachers, no expensive instrument at home to practice on whenever he wished. The story spread through the community center and then beyond as people began filming the remaining part of the showcase and posting about what they had witnessed. Within days, the video clips found their way to social media where they were shared hundreds and then thousands of times. Daniel's performance touching people who had never been in that room but could feel through the screen what the original audience had experienced. Messages began arriving for Patricia asking how to contact the boy, some from music teachers offering free lessons, others from local benefactors wanting to help, still others from journalists wanting to tell his story. A piano teacher named Margaret Chen, who had performed with symphony orchestras, before retiring reached out offering to take Daniel on as a student without charge, recognizing in him the kind of raw talent and musical sensitivity that appeared perhaps once in a generation. The local arts foundation established a small fund to support his musical education, enough to ensure he could continue developing his gift without the constant worry about access to instruments and resources. Daniel's life changed in ways both large and small following that afternoon at the community center, though he remained fundamentally the same quiet, determined person who had sat alone in the third row waiting for his turn. He began studying with Margaret Chen twice a week, finally receiving the structured guidance that his talent deserved, and she marveled at how quickly he absorbed concepts that took other students months to grasp. The local music school offered him time in their practice rooms whenever he needed, giving him consistent access to quality instruments. He performed at several more community events over the following months, each time drawing larger crowds of people who wanted to witness his gift firsthand. But perhaps the most significant change was in how he carried himself. The way his shoulders straightened slightly and his eyes met people's gazes more readily, as if being truly seen and valued for his abilities had given him permission to take up space in the world. The people who had been in the audience that March afternoon often spoke about the experience in the months and years that followed, describing it as one of those rare moments when assumptions are shattered, and something true and beautiful breaks through the ordinary surface of life. Many admitted feeling ashamed of their initial dismissiveness, of how readily they had judged the boy by his appearance and circumstances rather than giving him a fair chance to show what he could do. The experience became a kind of parable in the community about the dangers of prejudgment, about how talent and worth have nothing to do with external markers of status or wealth. Parents used the story to teach their children about looking beyond surfaces, about treating everyone with dignity regardless of how they appeared. The old piano in the community center became something of a local landmark, the instrument that had responded so beautifully in Daniel's hands serving as a reminder of what was possible when skill and soul came together. Margaret Chen often said in interviews that Daniel was the most naturally gifted student she had encountered in 40 years of teaching, possessing not just technical ability, but that indefinable quality that separated competent musicians from true artists. She worked with him on expanding his repertoire and refining his technique, but she was careful never to polish away the emotional honesty that made his playing so compelling. Under her guidance, he began preparing for conservatory auditions, aiming for schools that could provide the advanced training his talent warranted. The path ahead would not be easy, Margaret warned him. The world of classical music was competitive and often unforgiving, but she had no doubt that he possessed both the ability and the determination to succeed at the highest levels if he chose to pursue that path. 2 years after that transformative performance, Daniel was accepted to the Royal Academy of Music in London with a full scholarship, the admissions committee unanimous in their recognition of his exceptional promise. Before leaving for school, he gave a farewell concert at the same community center where his journey had taken its crucial turn, playing for a packed hall that included many of the same people who had witnessed his first public triumph. He performed the Chopin Nocturne again along with several other pieces, and while his technical command had grown even more impressive with proper training, what struck the audience most was that the essential quality that had moved them so deeply remained unchanged. He still played with that same profound emotional honesty, that ability to reach past the notes into something deeper and more universal. When he finished his final piece, the standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, the community that had discovered him now celebrating his success as their own, proud to have played even a small part in his remarkable story. Patricia Hayes kept a photo on her office wall from that original March afternoon, a candid shot someone had captured of Daniel at the piano, his eyes closed and his face serene with concentration. She looked at it often, remembering how close she had come to dismissing him before he ever played a note, how the entire room had been prepared to ignore or mock this poor boy until his music demanded they listen. The image reminded her, and anyone who saw it, that genius and beauty can emerge from the most unexpected places, that the shabby exterior might contain treasures beyond imagining, and that the greatest mistake we can make is to decide who deserves our attention and respect based on anything other than their character and their gifts. The boy they had mocked had hushed everyone with one song, and in doing so had taught them all something far more valuable than they could have learned from 1,000 ordinary performances. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. The music continued to unfold with such beauty that several people in the audience felt their eyes welling up with unexpected tears, moved by something they couldn't quite name or explain. There was a purity to Daniel's playing that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to the heart, touching places that words could never reach. The way he shaped each phrase showed not just technical mastery but genuine artistic maturity, an understanding of emotional nuance that seemed far beyond his years. His body moved subtly with the music, swaying gently as if he were being carried along by the current of the melody rather than creating it himself. The connection between the performer and the piece was so complete that it felt less like he was playing the piano and more like he was translating some universal language of feeling into sound that everyone present could understand regardless of their musical background or education. In the fourth row, a woman named Sarah Mitchell sat completely still, her hand covering her mouth as tears rolled silently down her cheeks. She had lost her husband 6 months earlier and had come to the showcase only because her sister had dragged her out of the house, insisting she needed to be around people again. She had expected to feel nothing, to sit through the afternoon in the same numb fog that had surrounded her for half a year. But Daniel's playing had somehow penetrated that fog, the music expressing grief and beauty and hope in ways that made her feel less alone with her pain. Next to her, her sister reached over and squeezed her hand, both women connected by the unexpected grace of this moment. Across the aisle, an elderly man named Thomas Webb sat with his eyes closed, transported back to his youth when he had dreamed of becoming a concert pianist himself before practical considerations and family obligations had led him down a different path. Hearing this young man play with such passion and skill awakened something in him that he thought had died decades ago, a reminder of who he had once hoped to become. The technical demands of the piece were considerable, requiring precise fingerwork and careful pedaling to achieve the proper balance between melody and accompaniment. Daniel navigated these challenges with apparent ease, his left hand providing a steady harmonic foundation while his right hand sang out the lyrical main theme. There were moments of intricate passage work where his fingers flew across the keys with breathtaking speed and accuracy, and other moments where a single note was held and allowed to resonate, given space to breathe and speak. He understood instinctively when to push forward and when to pull back, when to let the music rush ahead with momentum, and when to linger in a moment of particular beauty. This kind of interpretive intelligence usually came only with years of performance experience and guidance from master teachers. Yet somehow this self-taught boy possessed it naturally, as if the music itself had been his teacher all along. Patricia found herself thinking about all the talented young people who never got the chance to develop their gifts because circumstances worked against them, because poverty or lack of access or simple bad luck prevented them from finding the opportunities they needed. How many other Daniels were out there, she wondered, sitting in shabby clothes with extraordinary abilities locked inside them, waiting for someone to give them a chance to show what they could do. The thought filled her with both sadness for all the potential that went unrealized and determination to make sure this particular boy didn't slip through the cracks. She made a mental note to contact everyone she knew in the local music community as soon as the showcase ended, to make sure Daniel got connected with resources and teachers who could help him develop his obvious gifts. This was exactly why she had continued organizing these events year after year, despite the modest turnout and limited budgets. Because occasionally something magical happened that justified all the ordinary afternoons. The middle section of the nocturne brought a shift in mood, the music turning slightly darker and more turbulent before eventually finding its way back to the gentle main theme. Daniel captured this emotional journey perfectly, his playing growing more intense and urgent during the stormy passages without ever losing control or becoming harsh. Even in the most technically demanding moments, his touch remained beautiful, each note clear and singing rather than percussive or mechanical. The audience rode the waves of emotion with him, tension building in their chests during the agitated sections and releasing into relief when the melody returned to its peaceful character. Several people later described feeling almost exhausted by the experience, drained in the way that profound emotional encounters leave us feeling emptied out and somehow fuller at the same time. This was not entertainment in the superficial sense, but rather a genuine artistic experience, the kind that reminds us why humans create and share music in the first place. A music teacher named Robert Chen, who happened to be in the audience that day, sat forward in his seat with professional interest, analyzing what he was hearing with a trained ear. He recognized immediately that Daniel's abilities extended far beyond amateur level, that this was someone with the potential for a serious career in music if given proper guidance and opportunities. The boy's natural musicality was extraordinary, but equally impressive was his technical foundation, which must have required countless hours of disciplined practice despite having no formal teacher to correct his mistakes or guide his development. Robert made note of a few small technical habits that could be refined with proper instruction, minor issues with hand position and posture that were completely understandable given that Daniel had taught himself. But these were easily correctable details that did nothing to diminish the overall impact of the performance. He found himself already planning how he might approach the boy after the showcase, wanting to offer help without seeming condescending or making Daniel feel like a charity case. The music moved toward its conclusion with a return to the opening theme, now enriched by everything that had come before, the melody taking on deeper meaning through repetition and variation. Daniel played these final pages with exquisite tenderness, his touch growing lighter and more delicate as the piece gradually wound down toward silence. There was a vulnerability in these closing moments, a sense of something precious being offered and then gently withdrawn, leaving only memory and longing in its wake. His face showed complete serenity now, all nervousness and self-consciousness dissolved in the act of making music. For these few minutes he had been fully himself in a way that perhaps he rarely got to experience in his daily life, free from judgment and limitation, existing purely as a conduit for beauty. The transformation was so complete that people who had seen him shuffle nervously onto the stage could hardly believe this was the same person. Challenges and joys of pursuing music, the older man offering encouragement and the younger listening with respectful attention. Before they parted, Thomas pressed a business card into Daniel's hand, insisting that the boy call him if he ever needed help or support in pursuing his musical education. The remainder of the showcase continued, but everyone present knew that nothing could possibly match what they had already experienced. The subsequent performers did their best and received polite applause, but the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted, spoiled perhaps for ordinary entertainment by the extraordinary gift they had been given. Patricia went through the motions of introducing acts and managing the program, but her mind kept returning to Daniel, already forming plans and making mental lists of people she needed to contact. She caught his eye several times during the remainder of the afternoon, and each time he gave her a small shy smile that made her heart ache with the mixture of his obvious talent and his apparent lack of support or resources. How was it possible, she wondered, that someone with such remarkable abilities was sitting alone in shabby clothes with no family present to witness his triumph? When the showcase finally ended and people began filing out, many made a point of stopping to speak with Daniel again, offering congratulations and asking questions about his musical background. He answered politely but minimally, clearly uncomfortable being the center of so much attention, his natural shyness reasserting itself now that the protective barrier of performance was gone. Robert Chen waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching, introducing himself as a piano teacher and asking if Daniel would be willing to meet for coffee sometime to discuss his musical education. The boy's eyes lit up with cautious hope at the offer, though he was careful not to seem too eager, as if he had learned to protect himself from disappointment by not expecting too much from adult promises. They exchanged contact information with Robert, making clear this was a genuine offer, not just polite words that would be forgotten as soon as they parted. Patricia pulled Daniel aside before he left, her clipboard once again forgotten as she focused entirely on this unexpected discovery. She asked for his contact information and permission to share it with some people she knew in the local music community, explaining that she believed he deserved opportunities to develop his obvious talent. Daniel hesitated, clearly unused to adults taking such interest in his well-being, before finally agreeing and providing his mother's phone number since he didn't have a cell phone of his own. The detail struck Patricia as yet another reminder of how much this boy lacked in material terms despite his wealth of ability. She promised to be in touch within a few days and made him promise not to give up on music no matter how difficult circumstances might seem. He nodded solemnly, perhaps not quite believing that anything would come of these promises but wanting to hope anyway. As Daniel finally left the community center that afternoon, stepping out into the gray Manchester evening with his worn jacket pulled tight against the March wind, he carried with him something he hadn't possessed when he arrived. It wasn't just the memory of the applause or the kind words from strangers, though those were precious enough to someone accustomed to being overlooked. It was something more fundamental, a new understanding of his own worth and the power of his gift to move and connect with others. For years he had practiced in secret, stolen moments at various pianos around the city, driven by love of music but never quite sure if what he was creating had any real value. Now he knew with certainty that his playing mattered, that it could touch people's hearts and temporarily lift them out of their ordinary concerns into something higher and more beautiful. That knowledge would sustain him through the challenges that still lay ahead. Patricia sat alone in the empty community center after everyone had gone, the folding chairs standing in their crooked rows and the old piano sitting silent on the stage. She thought about Daniel walking home to whatever difficult circumstances awaited him there. This boy who could create such beauty but probably went to bed hungry sometimes and wore the same clothes day after day. The injustice of it burned in her chest, the random cruelty of a world where talent was distributed without any regard for who could afford to nurture it. But she also felt energized with purpose, determined to make sure this particular story had a better ending than so many others like it. She picked up her phone and began making calls even before she left the building, reaching out to every contact she had in the music education world, telling Daniel's story and asking for help. By the time she locked up for the night, she had already received several promising responses from people moved by what she described and willing to offer support. The video footage that audience members had recorded on their phones began circulating online that very evening, shared first within local community groups, and then spreading wider as people tagged friends and music teachers who might be interested. The quality was imperfect, captured on phone cameras from various angles with occasional coughs and shuffling sounds interrupting the audio, but the essence of Daniel's performance came through clearly enough to affect viewers who hadn't been in the room. Comments poured in expressing amazement at his talent and asking how they could help support his musical education. Several professional musicians shared the videos with notes about the remarkable level of skill and musicality on display. A classical music blogger with a substantial following wrote a post about Daniel titled "The Hidden Genius of Manchester" that was read by thousands of people and prompted inquiries from music schools and foundations dedicated to supporting talented young artists from disadvantaged backgrounds. Within a week of the showcase, Patricia's phone was ringing constantly with offers of help for Daniel. Margaret Chen, a retired concert pianist who had performed with major orchestras across Europe before settling in Manchester to teach, reached out offering to take Daniel on as a student free of charge after watching the video footage. She explained that in 4 decades of teaching, she had rarely encountered anyone with such natural musical sensitivity combined with obvious technical ability, and she considered it her professional and moral obligation to help nurture that talent. A local arts foundation reached out offering to establish a small scholarship fund that could cover costs associated with Daniel's musical education, including sheet music, competition fees, and eventually conservatory application expenses. The regional youth orchestra invited him to audition for a position, waiving their usual participation fees. A piano dealer offered to arrange regular practice time on quality instruments at his showroom after hours when the space would otherwise sit empty. Daniel's mother, Maria, was overwhelmed when Patricia called to explain all the offers of support that had materialized. She had known her son loved music and practiced whenever he could find access to a piano, but she had no idea he possessed such extraordinary ability or that his playing could move people so profoundly. Working 2 jobs to keep her small family afloat left little time or energy for attending to anything beyond immediate survival, and she carried guilt about not being able to provide music lessons or other enrichment activities for her children. Now strangers were offering to help in ways that seemed almost too good to be true, and she broke down crying on the phone as Patricia assured her the offers were genuine and that Daniel deserved every bit of support he was being given. They arranged a meeting for later that week so Maria could meet some of the people who wanted to help, and they could work out the practical details of how Daniel's musical education would proceed. The meeting took place in a small conference room at the community center, with Patricia facilitating introductions between Daniel, his mother, and the various people who had offered support. Margaret Chen attended, as did Robert Chen, who turned out to be her nephew, along with representatives from the Arts Foundation and the Youth Orchestra. Daniel sat quietly through most of the discussion, seemingly stunned by the attention and opportunities being presented to him, occasionally glancing at his mother as if to confirm this was really happening. Margaret asked him to play for her on the old upright piano, wanting to assess his technique and abilities directly rather than relying only on video footage. He performed a Bach prelude with crystalline precision, and then a Debussy piece that showcased his sensitivity to color and atmosphere. Margaret listened with her eyes closed, occasionally nodding, and when he finished she opened her eyes and said simply that she would be honored to work with him. Over the following months, Daniel began studying with Margaret twice a week, finally receiving the structured technical training and musical guidance that his talent warranted. She marveled at how quickly he absorbed new concepts and corrected long-standing technical habits, his hunger to learn and improve evident in every lesson. His hands, she noted, were not particularly large or naturally suited to piano, but he had developed remarkable strength and independence in his fingers through sheer determination and countless hours of practice. She worked on refining his technique while being careful never to dampen the emotional honesty and directness that made his playing so compelling. Too often, she explained to Patricia, formal training polished away the very qualities that made young musicians interesting, turning them into technically proficient but emotionally sterile performers. With Daniel, she was determined to enhance his natural gifts rather than reshape him into some conventional mold. The local music school provided Daniel with a practice room he could access whenever he needed, giving him consistent time with quality instruments for the first time in his life. He began spending hours there after school and on weekends, working through the repertoire that Margaret assigned and exploring pieces that caught his imagination. The practice room became a sanctuary for him, a place where he could escape the stress and limitations of his home life and exist purely in the world of music. The school's director sometimes stood outside the door listening, amazed by the sounds emerging from the room and grateful they had been able to provide this space for someone who used it so purposefully. Other students at the school became aware of Daniel and occasionally gathered to listen when he played, drawn by the beauty of his performances even during practice sessions. Daniel gave several more public performances over the next months, each time drawing larger and more enthusiastic crowds as word spread about the talented young pianist who had been discovered at a community showcase. He played at a fundraiser for the Arts Foundation that had supported him, at a concert organized by the youth orchestra, and at a recital featuring Margaret's most advanced students. Each performance demonstrated his growing technical command and deepening musical understanding. But the essential quality that had moved people during that first showcase remained unchanged. He still played with complete emotional honesty, still seemed to disappear into the music in a way that invited audiences to join him in that private emotional space. Reviews in local media praised not just his technical ability, but his remarkable maturity and communicative power, noting that he played with the authority and insight of someone much older and more experienced. His life changed in practical ways as well, though he remained fundamentally the same quiet, determined person he had always been. The scholarship fund provided money for better clothes and shoes, ending the visible poverty that had marked him so clearly during that first showcase. His mother was able to reduce her hours slightly at one of her jobs, relieved of some financial pressure by the support Daniel was receiving and by occasional paid performance opportunities that came his way. His younger sister Alina began taking piano lessons as well, inspired by her brother's success, and supported by Margaret, who offered family rates that were actually just another form of generosity. The family's circumstances remained modest, but the grinding desperation that had characterized their life eased somewhat, replaced by cautious hope that better days might be ahead. At school, Daniel's reputation shifted dramatically. Fellow students who had barely noticed him before now regarding him with mixture of respect and curiosity. Some sought to befriend him, drawn by his newfound local fame, while others kept their distance as if talent made him somehow foreign or threatening. He navigated these social changes with the same quiet grace he brought to everything, accepting kindness when it was offered genuinely, but keeping his distance from those who seemed interested only in associating with someone who had become locally notable. His real friends remained the few people who had valued him before anyone knew he could play piano. Kids from his neighborhood who had always accepted him despite his family's poverty. With them, he could still just be Daniel rather than that amazing pianist. Could talk about football and complain about homework and exist as a normal teenager rather than a prodigy requiring careful handling. Margaret pushed Daniel to audition for several prestigious summer music programs, believing he needed exposure to high-level training and the chance to work with other seriously talented young musicians. He was accepted to 3 programs and chose one in London that offered a full scholarship and the opportunity to study with renowned pedagogues. The 6 weeks he spent there were transformative, immersing him completely in music and surrounding him with peers who shared his passion and dedication. For the first time, he was neither the poorest student nor the most talented, but rather one among many gifted young people all working towards similar goals. The experience showed him both how much further he had to go to reach the highest levels of performance and how possible it was to get there with continued work and support. He returned to Manchester more confident and focused, his musical ambitions clarified and his determination strengthened. As Daniel approached the end of secondary school, discussions began about conservatory applications and what the next phase of his musical education should look like. Margaret was adamant that he needed to attend a top-tier music school, somewhere that could provide the level of instruction and opportunities his talent warranted. The Royal Academy of Music in London was the obvious choice given its reputation and proximity to home, but they also discussed possibilities at conservatories in Paris and Vienna. The application process was demanding, requiring recorded auditions, academic transcripts, personal statements, and letters of recommendation. Margaret threw herself into preparing Daniel, selecting repertoire that would showcase the full range of his abilities, and working with him on polish and presentation. She had no doubt he would be accepted given his obvious gifts, but she wanted to make sure his applications were as strong as possible to maximize scholarship opportunities. The day of Daniel's live audition at the Royal Academy arrived in late autumn, nearly 2 years after that first showcase at the community centre. He traveled to London with Margaret and his mother, the 3 of them staying in a modest hotel near the conservatory. Daniel was nervous in a way Margaret had rarely seen, understanding that this audition would largely determine the trajectory of his future career. She reminded him that he had already overcome so much just to reach this point, that he had nothing to prove to anyone but should simply play as he always did, with honesty and passion. That evening they walked through London together, Margaret pointing out concert halls where she had performed decades earlier, trying to distract Daniel from his anxiety and remind him that all professionals had once been nervous audition candidates wondering if they were good enough. The audition took place in a small recital hall within the conservatory. 3 faculty members sitting at a table with score copies and evaluation forms, while Daniel sat at a beautiful Steinway grand piano that responded to the slightest touch. He had prepared 3 pieces representing different style periods and technical demands: a Bach fugue, a Mozart sonata movement, and a Chopin etude. Margaret sat in the back of the hall, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, silently praying that Daniel would be able to show these judges what she knew he was capable of. He began with the Bach, and from the first notes Margaret relaxed slightly, hearing that he had found his center and was playing with his characteristic clarity and musical intelligence. The judges leaned forward, glancing at each other with raised eyebrows, clearly hearing something that captured their attention. By the time Daniel finished his 3 prepared pieces, the atmosphere in the room had changed completely, the judges no longer maintaining professional neutrality but openly engaged and impressed. They asked him to read a passage from an unfamiliar piece, which he navigated with remarkable accuracy despite the complex rhythms and harmonies. They asked questions about his musical background and training, clearly surprised to learn how recently he had begun formal study given the level of accomplishment he demonstrated. One of the judges, a distinguished professor who had taught at the conservatory for 30 years, asked Daniel to play something of his own choosing, anything he loved and wanted to share. Without hesitation, Daniel chose the Chopin Nocturne that had started everything. The piece he had performed at that community center showcase, when nobody expected anything from the poor boy at the piano. He played it even more beautifully now than he had 2 years earlier, his technical command more secure and his interpretation more nuanced, but with the same emotional core that had moved that first audience to tears. When he finished, the audition room sat in silence for a long moment before the senior judge smiled and said simply that they would be very pleased if Daniel chose to attend the Royal Academy, that in fact, they hoped very much he would accept their offer when it came. The formality of the statement couldn't disguise the enthusiasm behind it, and Daniel allowed himself a small smile of relief and pride. Margaret embraced him tightly as soon as they were out of the building, both of them laughing with joy and release of tension. His mother, who had waited outside unable to bear sitting through the audition, saw their faces and knew immediately that it had gone well. The 3 of them walked through London in the early winter darkness, talking excitedly about the future, stopping for a celebratory dinner at a restaurant that was far nicer than anywhere Daniel and his mother had ever eaten. The official acceptance letter arrived in December, along with notification of a full scholarship covering tuition, housing, and a modest living stipend. Daniel would begin at the Royal Academy the following September, joining a community of serious young musicians from around the world, all dedicated to developing their artistry to the highest possible level. The news was celebrated by everyone who had supported his journey, Patricia organizing a small reception at the community center where it had all begun. The same space that had witnessed Daniel's breakthrough performance now hosted a gathering to honor his success and thank all the people who had helped make it possible. The old piano sat on the stage decorated with flowers, and several people gave short speeches about what Daniel's story meant to them and to the community. Margaret spoke about the privilege of teaching someone with such natural musicality and dedication, while Thomas Webb talked about how Daniel had reminded him that dreams deferred are not necessarily dreams denied. Daniel was asked to perform, and of course he agreed, sitting at the familiar old piano that had been the instrument of his transformation. He played several pieces, including inevitably the Chopin Nocturne, and once again the room fell silent under the spell of his music. But this time the audience's wonder was mixed with pride, knowing not just that they were hearing something beautiful, but that they had played a part in nurturing the talent that created that beauty. Some had offered practical help, others had simply been witnesses who believed in him when belief mattered. But all of them had contributed in some way to the journey that was bringing Daniel from that first nervous performance to acceptance at one of the world's great conservatories. The applause when he finished was warm and prolonged, not the shocked amazement of that first showcase, but rather the deep satisfaction of seeing potential realized and hard work rewarded. In the months before Daniel left for London, he continued studying with Margaret and performing occasionally at local events, building repertoire and refining his technique in preparation for the intensive training ahead. He knew the Royal Academy would be challenging, surrounded by talented peers and demanding professors, but he felt ready for those challenges in ways he wouldn't have been possible without the support he had received. Margaret had given him not just technical training, but confidence in his musical instincts, teaching him to trust his interpretations while remaining open to new ideas. The Arts Foundation had removed financial anxiety that might have distracted from his studies, while the community's embrace had shown him that his gifts were valued, and his success mattered to people beyond just himself and his family. The day finally arrived when Daniel needed to leave for London to begin his studies at the Royal Academy. He said goodbye to his mother and sister at the train station, promising to call often and come home during breaks. Margaret had insisted on accompanying him to help with the initial settling in. Practical help that masked her own sadness at losing a student who had become far more than that over the past 2 years. On the train, they talked about what lay ahead, Margaret offering final bits of advice and encouragement, while Daniel listened with the same quiet attentiveness he brought to everything. She reminded him that talent alone was never enough for real success, that the conservatory would be full of talented people, and what would separate those who merely graduated from those who built significant careers would be work ethic, resilience, and the ability to maintain artistic integrity under pressure. Daniel settled into life at the Royal Academy with surprising ease, his years of practicing in borrowed spaces and making do with limited resources having prepared him well for the discipline required of conservatory students. His fellow students were indeed talented, some coming from wealthy families who had supported their musical education from early childhood, others like him arriving from modest circumstances with scholarships and grants. He found his place among them, earning respect through his playing and his work ethic rather than through social maneuvering. His professors recognized quickly that he was someone special, possessing not just technical facility but genuine artistic vision and the emotional depth to communicate that vision to audiences. They pushed him hard, as they did all their most promising students, knowing that the classical music world was brutally competitive and only those willing to work beyond normal limits would succeed at the highest levels. Throughout his first year, Daniel returned to Manchester during breaks, always stopping by the community centre to see Patricia and to play the old piano that had been the site of his first public triumph. These visits became a kind of ritual, a way of staying connected to the people and place that had made his current life possible. He would play for small audiences of community members, some who had been present at that original showcase and others who had only heard the story but wanted to experience his playing for themselves. These informal performances remained among his favorites, free from the pressure and competition of conservatory life, just pure sharing of music with people who appreciated it. Patricia always attended, her face glowing with pride as she watched the boy she had almost turned away from that first sign-up table now playing with polish and confidence that came from world-class training. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Please double-check responses.